There we go.
My story really begins when I was in college, actually graduating from college. Prior to college graduation, I'd only been on an aircraft one time. I flew to Washington, D.C. when I was 16. But when I graduated from college, I was very lost. I had spent 4.5 years studying to be a speech therapist, and when I got done with my degree, I didn't want to be a speech therapist. And so it was just really difficult to figure out what I was going to do next. We had a family friend that had worked, well, actually I had two family friends that had worked as flight attendants, and both of them told me that it was a great experience, an opportunity to travel all over the world, meet new people, and do that for free, you know, to get paid to travel. And so that's what I decided to do. So I applied and got a job with Continental Airlines. It's now called United Airlines. They've merged the two airlines, but a major airline. I went through 6 weeks of really intensive training. There is a little bit more to flight attending than just asking people what they'd like to drink and passing out pretzels. Your responsibility is the safety of the people on an aircraft in the case of a crash or any kind of emergency situation. So it was a really intense 6 weeks training. It was 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday. We would start at 7 a.m. and end at 6 p.m. You were tested every couple of days on the aircraft. You had to know all the ins and outs. You had to know all of the emergency procedures. And if you failed a test, you were kicked out of the program. So there was no, and really failure was like, I think we had to have at least 80%. So if you weren't, on your game with all of your exams and all that kind of stuff, they would send you home. So after completing the training, I got based out of Newark, New Jersey. Newark is right across the Hudson River from New York City. I was very excited about that. I had always wanted to live in New York, had always wanted to be in the city and that sort of thing, so I was pretty pumped about that. So I moved up there. I lived in an apartment with 5 other flight attendants. There were 6 of us total. We lived in a neighborhood, a section called the Ironbound, because it had railroad tracks on all sides, and everyone in the neighborhood spoke Portuguese, so I couldn't understand any of my neighbors. But it was just a lot of fun, a really great experience. I did get to travel. I went to several other countries. I went all over the United States. I've been to every major American city and been able to spend time there touring and seeing sights. So it was a really, really great experience. On September the 10th, the day before 9/11, my friend and I were actually headed into New York City because I wanted to go to the REI store. We were planning a backpacking trip on Mount Rainier. We were going to be hiking and climbing Mount Rainier. So I needed an internal frame backpack for that trip. So we headed to the REI store that was in the city and to get that backpack. So as Ms. Reeder told you guys, there was no social media, but really cell phones were very new. I had my first cell phone when I graduated from college, so take that in and understand that it was very different. I had my first cell phone. It did not text. There was no picture taking. It really was just a phone. You called people, they called you back. That was it. There was, voicemail. That was about as high tech as it got. And it was one of those flip phones. I think it was through Sprint. I don't even know if Sprint has phones anymore. But anyway, so on September the 10th, we went, we rode the train into the World Trade Center. The World Trade Centers were huge. I just don't even know if you can, until you've been there and seen them, if you can really get a picture or an idea of what the size of those buildings was. There was a shopping mall on the underground floor. There was a subway station with trains coming, a very large subway station coming in and out. And so it was very easy for me to ride. It probably took me 10 minutes to get from my apartment into the city, and I would take the train and actually come in under the World Trade Center. And then you could go out into the city and do whatever it was that you wanted to do. I actually had lunch at the World Trade Center on September the 10th. I have a scrapbook that's mostly, y'all can't laugh at my silly scrapbooking stuff, because scrapbooking was a thing a while back. But I have a picture that I took on September the 10th of the place that we ate lunch. And there was there were restaurants, and there was like a little outside fountain. It was probably, I don't know what floor we were on, but kind of like at the mid-level of the World Trade Center, so it was like an outdoor courtyard, and this big statue was there. You could eat lunch and hang out, that sort of thing. A lot of people that were working in the building, this might be where they would have eaten lunch. So I'll pass this around. There's some other pictures in there after 9/11 as well, and just some pictures of New York in general. But we ate lunch there. We went and got our backpack. We spent the whole day in the city. And then that evening, as we were coming back to the World Trade Center, my friend looked up at the towers, and they were so tall that you couldn't see the tops when the clouds would come in over the top of them. So when you were looking up, you just saw these two big buildings going up into the sky, and the tops were covered with clouds. And Wade said, wow, doesn't it look like, he stopped me and he said, doesn't it look like you could just get in your car and just drive right up the side and into the heavens? And it was just a kind of an odd moment, an odd thing for him to say, to be honest, but it was like this moment that we had where we just appreciated the size of the buildings. I will never forget that. And I would have forgotten it, you know, if this event had not occurred. So we stopped, we took time to appreciate just the sheer size of it, and then we went home, and the next day was a work day for me. So I got up just like I would on any other day, put on my Continental Airlines uniform and my little wings, and headed to the airport to work a flight that morning. I don't remember where we were headed. For some reason, I kind of feel like it might have been somewhere in Ohio. But it was not a full flight. There were a lot of business travelers. It was an early morning flight. And so we were taxiing on the runway. So it would have been around 9 o'clock. We could already see from our runway, that's one of the things about the Newark International Airport, is that you can see the sky, the New York skyline. It's right on the Hudson River, so you can see all the buildings. And we could see smoke coming out of the World Trade Center. And so the first plane had already hit. We didn't know that. We'd been taxiing, so we had no idea that that had happened. Our several businessmen were on our flight. They were concerned, looking out the window. You know, there was quite a bit of chatter. What's going on with smoke? There must be a fire. No one had any concept that an airplane had flown into the World Trade Center. That was not even a possibility in our minds. The captain of our flight called our crew up to the flight deck. We were standing in the flight deck, and he said, guys, the FAA has just grounded our flight. They haven't told us why. I believe they are grounding all of the aircraft. We're not going anywhere. We're gonna head back to the jetway. As we were having that conversation with him, the first officer pointed into the sky, and we watched as the second plane hit the second tower. We still had no idea. We didn't know if it was something that was just a control issue. Air traffic control had messed up. We didn't understand if maybe the plane was in trouble because of the smoke. I mean, it just did not register that this was a terrorist attack, or that anybody would ever do something like that. I want to back up to that flight attendant training I was talking about earlier. In that training, we definitely had a time when we were trained on what to do if a terrorist, you know, was on board your aircraft and trying to take over. But at the time, they told us to negotiate with the terrorist. They told us to tell them, we'll do anything you want, you know, just don't hurt anybody, we'll take you wherever you want to go. They were basing that training on hijackings that had occurred in the 70s largely, and they were usually people that wanted to just get out of the country, you know, so they were trying to escape law enforcement or something along those lines. They weren't necessarily a terrorist. And so that training proved to be very unhelpful in this event. And so I think about those flight attendants that were trained to be nice to these guys, when in actuality they were probably killed immediately before the plane might have even taken off. And so, so I just kind of, the other thing that I think is important to know is that knives were allowed on airplanes. There were no restrictions on what you could bring on an aircraft, except obviously for a bomb or a gun. But you could bring a pocket knife, you could bring a hunting knife, you bring knitting needles, sewing equipment, scissors, whatever. So none of those things would have been raised a red flag or or anything going through security prior to 9/11. So I think that's also an important thing to think about when you think about how this occurred.
And the security wasn't nearly as strict either, just in general.
Yes,
On and off
in
the
general,
planes,
it just
yeah.
wasn't, people just didn't think about those kinds of things, because this just was not in our realm of possibility. After we saw the second plane hit, we got back to the jetway, and when we got off the jetway, of course, our passengers all deplaned, and we were the last ones to come off the aircraft. A baggage handler was standing there. He delivered the news that the United States was under attack. And it really, I think that sometimes we think of this as it was just this one day and this one event, but it was the launch of a war, and it happened on our soil, on our ground. And Ms. Reeder can tell you when the last time that had happened, prior to, but that was the message that we were getting. So when you hear your country is under attack, you don't know what does that mean? How are we gonna manage this? What do I do now? Our crew was we all went down to our crew room for a security briefing. While we were having that briefing, the airport was evacuated because the aircraft that crash landed in Pennsylvania was actually hijacked from our airport. So that particular plane, that is the story, if you've ever heard the Let's Roll story, the passengers learned that that the other 3 aircraft had been crashed into buildings. This was the 4th plane that had been hijacked. Once they figured out that what the end was going to be, what the end result was going to be, they took over the aircraft and sacrificed themselves to save the lives of whoever that plane was headed for. And so that particular plane was hijacked from Newark International Airport, same place that I was in. I think about often going to work that day. Could I have passed one of these men? Could I have brushed up against them on the escalator? Could it have been my aircraft? There's a lot of what ifs. Certainly the date, having been in the World Trade Center on September the 10th, and then having this happen on September the 11th is not lost on me, that I'm very lucky that I wasn't on the aircraft or in the building that day, because it certainly could have been me. Thousands of people's lives were lost that day, whether they were in the buildings or whether they were firemen that came to the rescue, police officers. After that, our aircraft was evacuated, and I always laugh at myself. I was 23 when this occurred, so a baby, really. But I remember getting on a bus to try to get back to my apartment. You couldn't use your phone. The cell phones the lines were jammed or whatever. You couldn't make a call out. You couldn't get a call in. I couldn't get in touch with my family. My mom was a 2nd grade teacher at the time. Much like Ms. Reeder was explaining, her principal came. He knew that I worked for the airline. They were not releasing the names of the airlines at first. I don't think they released the names for at least 4 or 5 hours. So my mom was teaching. The principal came down and knocked on her door, just like she did for Ms. Reeder, just like you did for Ms. Reeder, and shared with her the news. So she didn't know whether or not I was affected. And so she had a really long day. The first person that I talked to was actually my now husband's mom. I talked to her about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I was able to finally get a message, be able to talk to somebody from home to let them know that I was okay. All of my roommates were put down wherever they were. Planes, they just landed airplanes. That was wherever you were. It didn't matter if that's not where you were headed. The closest airport, you were put down, and everything was shut down. So I was home alone for the next 3 days. And that was not a fun experience because I was watching the news a lot. It was really hard to just keep seeing those same scenes on television over and over again. I went back to the site about 3 weeks later. It was horrible. Miles from the actual site, there was ash and soot on everything. The explosion was just insane. I've talked to people that said that they went back 2 and 3 months later. You could still smell the jet fuel. You could still smell just the smells of that explosion, even 2 and 3 months later. I've not been back to the memorial. I've not been back to New York City. On October the 21st, I left Continental. It changed everything for everybody, but it did. 2,000 flight attendants from our company were laid off. So I was laid off after that event and had to move back home. I always kind of laugh at myself, as I was saying, I had to get on this bus to try to make my way back to the apartment after the evacuation of our airport. And this guy was sitting next to me, and he said, "This is gonna change the whole world. Everything is about to change, and we're all gonna lose our jobs." And I looked at him and I said, "Really? Like that could happen?" It just still did not register in that moment that this was gonna impact me at all. You know, I just was kind of doing my thing, and it did. It impacted me, of course, far less than it impacted others. But it was a surreal experience. I will always remember where I was, what I was doing. I think trauma is kind of a funny thing. You remember some things extremely vividly, you will never forget it, and then some things you kind of forget about. So it's just kind of an interesting deal. I also, like Ms. Reeder, recognized obviously the historics of the event. I picked up a copy of Time magazine while I was there. There's some fairly graphic images if you're not one that can handle that. I wouldn't look at all the pictures, but y'all are welcome to look at that. Do y'all have any questions?
Did this influence you becoming the guidance counselor in any way? Do you think that had an impact on going from speech therapy to what you do now? Do you think that's a connection?
No, I think that this is kind of my college advice to you guys as juniors. Y'all are gonna be thinking about this. I was a great student, and I went into speech therapy, and I made A's. I didn't make any, I always made A's. I don't mean that to brag, but I was just a good student. Like, I did my work, I studied hard, and I did what I was supposed to do, and I didn't try anything else. You know, it was like, I just was afraid to try anything else, and so, like, because everybody says, oh, you're gonna change your major 1,000 times when you get to college, and I just didn't do that. I was like, okay, this is what I picked, and I'm just gonna see it through. And then I got to the practicum and the clinicals, and I was like, I hate this. This is horrible. And so it took me a long time to figure out what I was meant to do. So I don't know that really had much to do with it.
Do y'all have any questions for him? Would you want to go back to visit the memorial? Do you think that's
I
something
would
that's
like to. My husband is not a New York City fan. So we were dating at the time, and he came to visit me one time, and he just does not like the city. He's a country guy, and all he did was, okay, do y'all remember those stupid salsa commercials where the guys would sit around, I don't even know what the salsa is, but they sit around and they go, New York City. Do you know what I'm talking about? No, they don't.
See, there's
Okay, anyway, that's all he did was walk around doing that and just acting silly. So anyway, we just kind of, yeah. I don't know if I can get, it'll have to be a girls trip because Jack is not interested. There's not fishing involved. It's really hard. Disney was a big step for him.
questions for her?
Y'all can't laugh at my little scrapbook. It's
Scrapbook
pretty
was the
cheesy.
thing. It was the
Scrapbooking
thing.
was
It was
the
the thing.
thing. And so, and that's like back in the days where you had your film developed.
Oh, yeah. Like, you didn't see your pictures for a while before.
Yes, exactly.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, y'all. Miss Reeder, you can hang on to those books.
Okay.
And,